Sometimes you watch a film, and this film has a character. When the film ends and you leave the theater, you are walking differently, thinking differently. You are, for a time, possessed by this character. If you have watched many films, you have most likely experienced this several times. If you're old enough to have seen the movie Tombstone when it was released, and if you're a man, then you surely walked out of the theater with the languid swagger of Doc Holliday. Perhaps you saw Goodfellas and became Joe Pesci's character, an outgoing hard ass who does not take shit from anyone. I remember driving home down Wilshire Boulevard after seeing Born Identity. I felt in complete control of my Ford Taurus, as if it were an extension of my body, weaving in and out of lanes with full situational awareness. This possession is always a very good feeling, and it's a terrible letdown when it ends, and it always comes to an end. How long it lasts depends upon factors almost entirely outside of our control. For instance, maybe you have work the next day. Your boss, someone you are certain would be under your dominion in a state of nature, is riding your ass. But you don't push back, too afraid to show him that no one is the boss of you. And just like that, you are no longer Hannibal Lecter. If you are very unfortunate, the spell is broken right away as you pass through the lobby of the theater, and a pack of youths direct at you some smart-ass remark. Too cowardly to confront them, you pretend to not have heard, and having been yanked so violently back down to earth, you continue on your way with that feeling of extra gravity pulling at your every step, lost entirely within your own head, your mind swirling with thoughts of violent reprisals and self-hatred. Now, even if you are lucky enough to not have your possession cut short, it is inevitable that it will fade on its own, and reality will reassert itself. The duration of it depends on many things. Obviously, the power of the character is important, but also where you are in life might play a part. For instance, if you are a teenager and full of anti-social sentiment, characters like Mickey Knox and Travis Bickle might make a strong impression. But as you get older and more mature, maybe you'll be more susceptible to characters that are morally upright and courageous. Who knows? I tend to believe the strong anti-social characters remain appealing throughout. Speaking of Mickey Knox, did you know that Forrest Gump and Natural Born Killers were released in the same year? I learned in that year I could go from being infected by the simple goodness of Gump to fantasizing about gunning down strangers in convenience stores. This might be confusing to someone who assumes one can only be truly moved by a character that represents an ideal one aspires to. However, it begins to make sense if you instead recognize that more than whatever ideal the viewer holds dearest, the necessary condition for the kind of possession I'm talking about is the effective portrayal of strong character. Now, I will get into what specifically I mean by strong character in a bit. For the moment, let me provide an anecdote to give you some idea. I used to work a corporate job, a cubicle existence. I had a female boss whom I absolutely loathed. She had a knack for always bringing me down when I was filling up. Most days I would sit at my desk in a simmering rage. She always managed to stop just short of sending it into a boil. At some point I thought to myself, one of these days I'm going to become unreasonable. This was a spontaneous thought. I didn't know exactly what I meant by it, but as I reflected on it, it became clear. I wanted more than anything to no longer be capable of tolerating those daily indignities. I wanted to have a constitution that would simply not allow it. I longed for a will that could not act otherwise than to express my utter contempt and lack of respect. Nothing violent, of course, but something like pulling up an erotic image on my dual monitors and begin masturbating at my desk. When she would approach, all shocked, I'd calmly tell her to fuck off. What I do on my break is my business. Not that necessarily. There are pretty stiff penalties for public exposure. But whatever, I think you get my drift. My point is, I wanted a strong character. And this led to a sort of appraisal of the kinds of characters that had made the strongest impact on me over the years. Most importantly, I wanted to discover which character or characters had the most lasting impact. It was easy to discard those with a superior intellect and those with near superhuman abilities. I have no illusions about being able to simply will these things into existence. So then I was left with only those whose character was within at least the realm of the attainable. But most of these did not fully align with my deepest desire. It was crucial for me to determine not that character whom I most wanted to be like, rather that character whom I felt was already within me, crying to be let out. In the end, it was easy. Of course, it's Fletch. I had developed a neuroticism in my late teens that continued into my 20s. Sometimes it was crippling. And I've always had a handful of films that I regard as my sort of go-to movies to put me in a good mood or for a pleasant background while I do other things, Fletch was one of them, and it, more than any other, was my go-to when I was obsessing over some perceived slight or embarrassment or whatever, and it almost never failed to, in a way, shame me out of it. In the absence of a friend that would simply tell me to get over it and be a man. It was telling me this, but not just any man. It was telling me, be Fletch. But because I hadn't fully investigated beyond the surface level differences between myself and Fletch, I was unable to implement any lasting changes to my approach to life. That is, until I decided to think seriously about what it means to have a strong character. So now then is a good time to explain what exactly I mean by this. First of all, I think it a handy visual to imagine character in its original meaning as an engraving or imprinted mark. That is, as something fixed, set in stone, if you will. If you think of it in this way, it brings more clearly into focus the idea of a strong or weak character, and makes it distinct from the idea of character as someone who is unusual or eccentric, like old so-and-so. He can't stop yelling at strangers in the park. He's quite the character. For a strong character, then, I imagine a deep, unmistakable engraving of, say, the person's name. I imagine that moment at the end of Dragnet episodes when the powerful, sweaty, blue-collar forearms come into frame and hammer that metal stamp into the stone. For the weak character, I just imagine a shallow, barely legible impression. I identify this weak character with the neurotic. And is there a greater contrast to the neurotic than Fletch? A neurotic cannot bring himself to even embellish his resume, let alone attempt to pass himself off as an airplane mechanic, knowing nothing of how airplanes work, or a surgeon, a junkie, an SEC agent. The career of investigative journalist would likely never even occur to him. The constant unpredictability and high likelihood of confrontational encounters would cause way too much anxiety for the neurotic, who hyperventilates the moment life throws him the slightest curveball. Fletch not only does these things without hesitation, but with a playfulness and seeming relish. Beyond this, he is clearly compelled by a sense of purpose. This is in contrast to one of my other favorite characters from fiction, also played by Chevy, Ty Webb from Caddyshack. Ty's way of being in the world is also very appealing to me, mainly in the same way as Fletch. It is free of neuroticism and exemplifies a type of aristocratic spirit. His lack of purpose, however, is not something I desire. I believe Harold Ramis was a Zen Buddhist. In light of this, it's pretty clear Ty Webb is his Zen ideal of detachment. This will probably be more appealing to me once the last bit of youthful vitality has left me, or if a peak beauty Sid Charisse type wants to run away to a secluded island, just the two of us. But for now, I want that compelling purpose of Fletch. His determination is truly admirable, especially when you consider his boss is insisting he submit his drugs on the beach story as is before he can discover the supplier. And even a death threat from the chief of police does not deter him. And his dogged pursuit of Alan Stanwyck's true motives is the result of self-propulsion. It is only very late he discovers the drugs story and Stanwyck are related. Now, what exactly this driving force within Fletch is not terribly important to me. You can claim he's obsessed with truth, getting to the bottom of a story. This seems reasonable, but once again, it's not something I'm that interested in. What truly interests me is this way of being in the world, which resembles life as a waking dream. Think of all the scenes in which he adopts one of his personas. Never does it lead with Fletch needing to take a moment to collect himself or psych himself up. Everything seems to happen in a seamless flow. And the film wastes no time showing him acquire any of his disguises or his preparation. This is important not only because it would be entirely unnecessary exposition, but also because it more accurately portrays the dream-like existence of a Fletch. That is an existence unburdened by excess consciousness. Most of us have had a taste of this when, for instance, we take a drive and, upon reaching our destination, realize we remember next to nothing of the journey. It is an experience of cutting from one scene to the next. The hyper-awareness of the neurotic prevents him from experiencing life this way. You could say he lives life too deliberately. As an aside, I like this word, deliberate, understood as deliberate, to describe the life of the neurotic. The overthinking and excessive self-consciousness that restrains him, preventing him from living the life of the dreamer. Now, the driving example may make it sound like I'm saying the dreamer is not living in the moment. But no, this is not what I'm saying. The dreamer is absolutely in the moment, but only in those times of import. Think of the car chase scene in which Fletch has commandeered the convertible and leads the police on a high-speed pursuit. He is fully present for this, so much so that he is able to outmaneuver them and even pretend to play hide-and-seek with one patrol car. It is the neurotic that is never fully in the moment. He is too concerned with trying to anticipate all possible outcomes of any action. In this way, he can never simply join into the rhythm of life and the playfulness of it. Remember when Fletch shows up at Mrs. Stanwyck's cabana at the tennis club, when she asks why he had a lunch order to be delivered to her cabana, he responds, "I knew this is where my mouth would be." A very funny line. Now, imagine a neurotic coming up with that line on the spot. He never would, but just imagine. He'd never have the balls to say it. He'd be too dumbstruck by this beautiful woman wearing only a towel and trying to calculate all the things he should or shouldn't say to get her out of it. This reminds me, one thing that should not go unmentioned is how handsome Fletch is. I'm sure many neurotics would say, yeah, make me a tall, tan, and handsome man who looks amazing in a pair of mid-thigh tennis shorts, and I'll too be perfectly at home in the world. And I must say, fair point. My only response to this would be to make the most out of what you have. Now, when I watch a film, I want to be lost in it. Ideally, I will remember very little of the plot when I reflect on a film. You could say I want the same experience I had as a child watching films. It is amazing how little I remember of some of my childhood favorites, seeing them again as an adult. For whatever reason, I loved Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4, The Dream Master. Well, it was on TV not that long ago, and it was my first time seeing it since childhood. Turns out I remembered no more than 5% of that film, and I mean literally like scene after scene that jogged no memory. I might as well have been seeing them for the very first time. But what I did remember, I remembered very vividly. And most of these were small things, a single shot or facial expression. Of course, I remembered things like the girl's grotesque transformation into a cockroach and Freddy holding the roach motel in his hand, crushing it, and that sticky substance oozing out of it. But just as vividly as I remembered that scene, I remembered that annoying fucking impression of a rabbit that the father of the protagonist made when she tried to feed him a salad for dinner. And get this, the scene in which the black one is running from Freddy through a junkyard. I only remembered the bit where he's running through a kind of corridor of junk cars stacked high on either side. He's stumbling and shielding his face with his arms as sparks fly from all directions. Just strange to me that this should be so vivid, yet I could not remember how Freddy would end up killing him, or that the scene ends with the camera pulling back to reveal the entire planet is a junkyard. Very trippy. You'd think that would have made an impression, but no. More than any other moment or scene, I remembered the brother of the protagonist practicing karate in the garage. But this is because Drama Rama's song Anything, Anything plays over it. I got my parents to buy me the soundtrack on the strength of that one song. So rewatching this film was revealing. I was reminded of how watching movies in the semi-conscious state of a child was far superior. My mind only bothered with those moments that had aesthetic import for me. The intellect was never allowed to butt in any noticeable way. Call me an anti-intellectual, I don't care. My preference is for a purely aesthetic experience. So all this just to say, unlike many of my childhood favorites, I have seen Fletch so many times throughout the years that I basically have the entire film committed to memory. I know the plot inside out. But I decided to watch it again a few days ago, specifically to watch for anything, however subtle, that might have slipped my notice. In doing so, I discovered something about Alan Sandwick's character that I could not believe I'd never got. Recall that first meeting between Fletch and Stanwyck at Stanwyck's mansion. When they first arrive, before going inside, Fletch makes that joke about being this close to buying the same mansion, but then he learned that Apollon Cassidy had died there, and it spoiled it for him. Stanwyck replies, "Ooh." He's never heard of Apollon Cassidy, but he knows Fletch is being a smartass, and he makes his annoyance apparent when they enter into the foyer, and Stanwyck asks if he is high on junk. Fletch responds with one of the funnier lines in the movie. He says, "Don't talk to me that way, ass face. I don't work for you yet." Now, why is this important? Jump forward to the climactic scene in which Fletch shows up to the mansion, ostensibly to carry out Stanwyck's plan. Of course, he finds Stanwyck waiting for him, dressed as Fletch in a baseball cap and Lakers jersey. It's interesting that there's this superficial role reversal as Fletch, for his part, has shown up wearing Stanwyck's suit. Perhaps we'll ruminate on this later. For now, however, I want to focus on Stanwyck's reaction when Fletch reveals his true identity and his full knowledge of Stanwyck's real plan to double-cross him and assume his identity. Stanwyck quickly grows frustrated and angrily refers to Fletch as assface, and shortly after as hopalong. This means that Fletch's disrespect has been absolutely gnawing at Stanwyck's pride since their first meeting. Assface is certainly not an insult you would expect him to use otherwise, and we know he'd never even heard of Apollon Cassidy until Fletch mentioned him. Now, prior to this revelation, I'd never sought to identify Fletch's opposite within the film, that is, the neurotic to Fletcher's dreamer. I knew Stanwyck was his opposite in a lot of ways, but I'd never thought of him as a neurotic. And maybe that's a bridge too far, but despite him being handsome and seemingly very confident, some of the signs are certainly there. The most telling is the one I just mentioned, an inability to let things go. Every affront to his dignity is dwelt upon pathologically, presumably even more so when it comes from someone he believes to be a junkie, and therefore far below his station. You can just imagine Stanwyck thinking to himself, "You should have smacked him then and there. But that could have ruined everything. Don't worry, you will make sure he knows he is the ass-face right before you shoot him between the eyes." By contrast, when Fletch calls Stanwyck ass-face, you can tell it is spontaneous. His aristocratic spirit will not allow disrespect to go unchecked, and it is not out of some kind of uncontrollable anger. He phrases it as a conditional statement, "I don't work for you yet." implying if he works for him, Stanwyck is free to call him assface as much as he wants. So even here, he has not lost his sense of humor. And more importantly, it's clear Fletch does not give the exchange a second thought. One senses he has forgotten it almost immediately as he continues into the mansion, taking it in and continuing to make his wisecracks. This, for me, is the admirable forgetfulness of the dreamer, the ability to allow all that is superfluous to simply fall away. And this may be the most crucial difference between him and the neurotic. I believe every negative attribute of the neurotic proceeds from this, what should we call it? Let's say overactive memory. From his excessive fear and resentment to his need to feel in total control over his every encounter with the world. In that first meeting with Stanwyck, he has some telling lines. When Fletch asks why he chose him, Stanwyck says, "You're a drifter." As in, who's going to miss a drifter? And when Fletch comments, "You've certainly thought this out," Stanwyck replies, "I'm not someone who leaves a great deal to chance." This is funny because it's chance that lands Fletch on a beach in Rio with Stanwyck's wife, the fate Stanwyck tried so hard to manufacture for himself. One result of this need to control for all variables that may arise is the kind of uptightness and humorlessness of Stanwyck. You see it in Fletch's boss as well. Remember the scene early in the film when Fletch arrives at the office and his boss is immediately hounding him, pressuring him for updates and assurances that the story is going to be ready by the deadline, etc. Ultimately, Fletch mocks him by offering a styrofoam cup, his hand shaking violently in imitation of his boss's noticeable jitters. His boss angrily snatches the cup out of his hand, and you can imagine him thinking, why can't this guy just be serious for 1 second? Does everything have to be a joke to him? His job is on the line, this kind of thing. But of course he just doesn't get it. He's too far removed from being Fletch-minded. To be fair, most of us are. Now, Fletch is not the only character type that is a suitable alternative to the neurotic. He is just the one that most appeals to me. I've thought about what other characters might have a similar appeal. One that came to mind is Cary Grant's character in North by Northwest, Roger Thornhill. Like Fletch, he has a way of reacting to any circumstance with a playfulness. For instance, even when he's being kidnapped at gunpoint by the two henchmen, he barely resists. And when they take him to the mansion where he first meets James Mason's character, he continues wisecracking despite being in a situation that would make most of us piss our pants. That scene in particular is what brought this movie to mind in relation to Fletch, because it reminds me a bit of the first time Fletch was taken to Stanwyck's mansion. However, I was never possessed by this Thornhill character. I may not be aware of all the reasons why, but I know the primary one is Cary Grant's zany, comedic, affected way of speaking. He says things like, "I'm not Kaplan, I'm Thornhill," like that. Thornhill. Why? And when they are driving him into the entrance of the mansion, there's a large sign at the entrance that has the name Townsend. But he has to say it like, who's Townsend? Just like that. This way of speaking is so distractingly annoying to me. It is much more at home in the screwball comedies he did. But here, anyway, I mean, I still like the movie. Eva Marie Saint is quite alluring. I always enjoy James Mason. And young Martin Landau has a wonderfully menacing presence. Oh, and you may think this odd, but I've always loved the short exchange between Thornhill and the young Indian woman at the front desk of the United Nations building. She has that very delicate little ASMR voice that I've heard on so many customer service calls, but he has a face to go with it, and it's the face I imagined. And it feels like such an authentic exchange. She is so pleasantly polite, but it is obviously mechanical for her. When she's given Thornhill the information he requested and he walks away, she doesn't even for a moment watch him leave. Her eyes stay down on whatever she was working on before he appeared. She has forgotten him just like that. This is not a mind that allows for flights of fancy. Since we're speaking of Hitchcock, I want to mention what is for me a sort of fun similarity between his film 39 Steps and Fletch. I'm sure you remember the scene where Fletch flees the police into that meeting of Shriners or union members or whatever they are, who are honoring their longtime member, Fred Dorfman. And Fletch assumes the role of MC. There's a very similar scene in 39 Steps. The main character, I don't recall his name, he is wound up in Scotland, where he flees from the pursuing police into a political gathering, and assumes the role of a political candidate. Like Fletch, he assumes this role with no hesitation and seems to effortlessly give himself over to it. And just as Fletch was able to get the audience singing the national anthem by the end, the character in 39 Steps is able to deliver a powerful enough speech to elicit applause from his audience. Like both Fletch and Thornhill, the character from 39 Steps remains good-natured throughout, no matter how harrowing the circumstances. However, both of these Hitchcock characters have something in common that does not apply to Fletch. They are the pursued. Their purpose consists primarily in not being caught by their pursuers, while trying to clear their names to end the pursuit altogether. Fletch, on the other hand, is the one doing the pursuing. You can say by the end, Thornhill has become the pursuer as he follows James Mason to Mount Rushmore to save Eva Marie. And of course, Fletch is ultimately chased by the police, as I've already said. But this changes nothing. I wonder if you're like me, and when you watched No Country for Old Men for the first time, did you get a sort of emotional charge when Josh Brolin's character, Llewellyn, has that brief phone conversation with Anton Chigurh? Llewellyn gets angry and tells Chigurh, decided to make you a special project of mine. You ain't gonna have to come look for me at all. When he said this, I thought, fuck yes. The pursued has become the pursuer. Turns out to be short-lived, of course, but still, after such an exhausting, relentless pursuit, I was ready for him to turn the tables. Since I prefer characters that are internally driven, it should go without saying that I like vigilante characters and characters out for vengeance, etc. Characters like Paul Kersey, John Rambo, and the main character in Old Boy. But usually something unthinkably awful had to happen to them or their loved ones to make them so driven and singularly focused. And as a result, they lack any sense of joie de vivre. You could say to live like one of them would be comparable to what gamers refer to as on-rails gameplay. That is, an inability to meander or wander from a set course, primarily because nothing but revenge is of any interest to them. The opposite being a fully open world where you're free to roam around as aimlessly as you please. This, I believe, is undesirable as well. And it is Fletch who, I believe, occupies the space between these two extremes. He is neither aimless nor totally on rails. For instance, his involvement with Stanwyck is one long side mission that happened to tie in with the main story. And also the engine that drives vigilante characters is memory. And for good reason. What kind of person would forget his wife and children being raped and murdered? That would make him as villainous as the perpetrators. But to be saddled with a memory so traumatic that it consumes the rest of your life is not an enviable thing. It makes for a strong character, but a pathological one. So, while it makes sense that we can easily become possessed by this type of character, and we may wish we had the courage to, rid the streets of scumbags, we should be thankful we haven't yet had to endure what would make us incapable of doing otherwise. As I've already said, Fletch is not burdened in this way. He even requires a memory aid in the form of a tape recorder. That scene on the airplane, in which he's organizing his thoughts into the recorder, also highlights his absent-mindedness. The fact he presses play rather than record, and has to fumble with the buttons a few more times before he presses the correct one. Also, remember that moment at the tennis club in which he accidentally bangs the side of the packed car with his tennis racket as he does a practice swing, then simply walks away whistling, or when he's showing Mrs. Stanwyck the photos of the deed to the property Alan had purchased, then proceeds to show her several unrelated photos he took while in Utah. And speaking of Utah, there's the moment at the airline ticket counter that I'm sure many people assume is lazy writing or something. Fletch is inquiring into the flight to Rio, booked in his name. The woman informs him that it has a stopover in Provo. Fletch asks, Provo, Spain? This must seem ridiculous to anyone who doesn't understand Fletch. Not only was Provo mentioned by name earlier, but he has just been on a trip to Utah. One, it's funny. If you need any more justification than that, grow up. Two, well, it is ridiculous that he'd forget that. I'm not going to kill myself trying to come up with some reasonable explanation. However, maybe his mind actively suppresses thoughts of Utah. After all, the film does present it as a very grim place. Gil Stanwyck even cracks that Utah is not exactly a cure for boredom, and Fletch agrees. Before I forget again, there's something else I wanted to mention about 39 Steps in relation to what I've been saying about excessive memory. If you remember, the character at the center of the mystery turns out to be Mr. Memory. Side note, how Lynchian is that name? Can't you imagine some underworld type, the color immediately drained from his face, an expression of pure dread on being informed he's been summoned by Mr. Memory? I sure can. But in 39 Steps, Mr. Memory is a performer whose talent is his prodigious memory. He performs before audiences who shout to him questions about historical dates and things like this. And he always has the right answer. So it's not some trick. He really does remember all this shit. I mention this because Hitchcock seems to recognize what a colossal burden this must be. For one thing, Mr. Memory follows up every answer by asking, "Am I right, sir?" Now, this is a small thing, but it strikes me as a neurotic trait, excessively deferential. But I'll let you decide on that one. The big thing, however, is at the end of the film when the main character asks about the 39 Steps. Mr. Memory begins to answer and is shot by one of the conspirators before he can finish. It is a mortal wound. He is helped backstage, and the main character then asks him what secret he was carrying for the 39 Steps. Mr. Memory asks if it's okay to tell him, and once again, after he reveals the secret, which is some kind of formula for making engines run silently, but after he shares this, he once again asks, "Am I right, sir?" This is a man breathing his last breaths, and he is still compelled to ask this question. And I remember the main character has his hand on the shoulder of Mr. Memory, and very warmly assures him, "That's quite right, chap." And this is the crucial moment. Rather than any fear or terror for his imminent death, he thanks the main character, and then, as if the weight of the world has just been lifted from his shoulders, says, "I'm glad it's off my mind, at last." He then passes peacefully. With Mr. Memory in mind, I want to return to what I was saying about strong and weak character. Hopefully it's clear that I'm not saying there's only one type of strong character and one type of weak character. I do view it as a spectrum, with the out for vengeance type and his tunnel vision on one end, and the neurotic paralyzed with fear on the other. A strong character comes with a firm identity. There are behaviors and actions that are incompatible with a strong identity. When Alex in A Clockwork Orange undergoes the treatment, the prison chaplain protests that he can no longer choose freely, and absent the ability to choose, he ceases to be a man. This may be true, but if he were free to choose to act compassionately, charitably, he'd cease to be Alex. In this case, we're talking about a sadistic hooligan, and if you encountered him in real life, you'd be thanking your lucky stars if he could simply choose to not be that way. But ask yourself, if you could choose to act in no other way than the most noble, heroic, valorous way as called for in any situation, would you not choose it? Is it really that important to you to be able to say, I chose to act courageously? I suspect for the truly courageous, the cowardly act is a foreign concept, just as the noble act is foreign to the thug. Both the thug and the hero are strong characters, and for this reason both are appealing, in fiction anyway. In reality, however, one is obviously preferable to the other. But I can assure you of one thing, neither the hero nor the thug would trade places with the neurotic. You may be horrified by the story of some youth knocking out an unsuspecting elderly man just for kicks. Maybe you'd be just as horrified to know that same youth has already experienced more joy and contentment than you will in your entire life. The reality is some young, sensitive, romantic type serenading the girl he has loved from afar outside her bedroom window, and that same youth who just butt-fucked the romantic's love object appearing at the window, buck naked, to tell him to shut the fuck up as he's exhausted and trying to get some sleep. I speak here from some experience. In my own youth, I spent a considerable amount of time with this sort. Perhaps I was seeking an escape from my own neuroticism. But one in particular, who I spent more time with than any other. I remember us joking around one day, and I said to him something like, maybe if you read a book sometime, you wouldn't be such a dumbass. And he responded, I clown on dudes that read. He got his dick sucked on a whim by a girl I'd had my eyes on for months, but was too shy to express my feelings to. This left a lasting impression, to say the least. It did not make me want to be a sociopathic brute like my friend. I just recognized my neuroticism was a major hindrance to the kind of life I wanted for myself. And as I've already said, I would eventually get around to investigating why I couldn't just be more like Fletch, my favorite character from fiction. I made many discoveries. First of all, I realized I had internalized a notion of existential dread or life as a problem as superior to the seeming, let's say blind acceptance of the average person. A sort of rationalization, like, oh, this is the only sane way to react to the world. How can you look upon the spectacle of all this lunatic phenomena and not be paralyzed? So pompous. And so thinking this way while feeling the opposite. Obviously, I did not feel superior to these people. Mostly I was filled with jealousy and resentment. Another discovery was that I was spending entirely too much time dwelling on the past, troubling and happy memories, biggies and no biggies alike. But perhaps the most important discovery was the degree to which all the others proceeded from a physiological source. I was living an unhealthy life. It's remarkable how quickly one can escape the doldrums by simply taking a walk in the sun, maintaining a regular sleep schedule, and keeping to a halfway healthy diet, and of course avoiding too much alcohol or other drugs. This, more than anything, is the key to a sunny disposition. It makes me angry to recall all the time wasted trying to think my way out of misery. But back to the spectrum I mentioned before. Now, it can also be thought of as representing levels of consciousness, from the bare minimum at one end to dangerously excessive at the neurotic level. At this level is where you'd expect to find identity issues. It is where one is most outside of himself, unable to lose himself in the moment, most bothered by the question, who am I? You ever observe people at a party? The most conspicuous are those who have given themselves over completely to the moment, laughing uproariously, dancing and singing. These are the party animals. This phrase is very accurate. To be this way requires a healthy dose of the animal. If you are a neurotic, you may dismiss this type as dumb. And it may be the case that more intelligence is found at the neurotic end, but ask yourself at what cost. And I don't believe IQ means one is cursed to be an uptight nerd. The Chris Knight in Real Genius type must be possible. And a lot of neurotics are not especially intelligent. Plenty of them are like Mr. Memory, mere memorizers. This type is not capable of generating any interesting thoughts of their own. The most impressive ones are little more than a human search engine. Most, however, are obnoxious sorts that throw out citations as if they were weapons. They are not intellectually curious. One suspects they take in as much information as they can to compensate for their inability to live, and to comfort themselves that those Neanderthals who are out there enjoying themselves to no end could never make it through gravity's rainbow. And if they tried, they wouldn't understand a lick of it. To distinguish this type from the genuinely intellectually curious, I refer to them as dorks. D-O-R-K. They do not deserve to be designated as nerds. A nerd, for me, is someone who is legitimately obsessed with a subject. He craves to know as much about it as possible, and far from feeling threatened by someone who may know something he doesn't, he is happy to learn. And a nerd is capable of contributing because his interest doesn't end with taking in the word of the experts. It should go without saying, then, that I have some respect for nerds and contempt for dorks. But both nerds and dorks will be found at the periphery of the party, wishing death on the party animals, while their eyes dart about the room, trying to get a read on how they are being perceived. This is all a very long way of getting to my belief that Fletch represents the sweet spot of consciousness. As I said earlier, he represents the dreamer. That is, to experience the world as Fletch is an approximation of what it would be like for life to be a waking dream. He is far from neurotic and far from a party animal. He is a strong character, so has a strong identity. Fletch is Fletch, and there are behaviors that would be entirely out of keeping with his character. Yet, he has the ability to become whoever the situation calls for, and he seems to be able to do this through pure instinct. This is my attempt to sort of reason backwards. I identified Fletch with the dreamer many years ago, without even thinking about it. But recently, when I watched the film again for the explicit purpose of looking for anything I may have missed, I was treated to a wonderful surprise. I suppose I had never sat through the entire end credits. This is something I rarely do. A lot of cinephile types will stay seated till the last credit rolls and the theater lights come on. Whatever. I'm sure they have their reasons. I've only been compelled to do this when a film absolutely blew me away, and I simply wanted to hold on to that feeling as long as possible. I must remember to talk sometime about my attitude toward people who want to discuss a film right after watching. But for now, back to the end credits of Fletch. You may remember the credits roll over various still images from throughout the film, a kind of highlight reel. Imagine my delight when the credits coming to an end, the last image they chose to hold on before fading to black is the close-up of Fletch with his head on his pillow, asleep, with the contented expression of the untroubled dreamer.